America's biggest trade nightmare just became reality. China, once the largest buyer of U.S. goods, is cutting off American imports and replacing them with Canada and Europe. The stakes: billions of dollars in lost revenue, thousands of jobs on the line, and a trade war spiraling out of Washington's control. But what's really behind this shift? Did Trump's tariffs backfire? Is Canada stepping into America's role as a global supplier? And could this force the U.S. economy into crisis? Stay tuned, because by the end of this video, you'll see just how deep this rabbit hole goes. Trump's 2018 tariffs on Chinese imports, aimed at reviving U.S. manufacturing, instead triggered one of the most costly trade wars in modern history. The Peterson Institute for International Economics reported that U.S. firms paid over $165 billion in additional tariffs, while Chinese retaliation decimated American exports. The U.S. agricultural sector suffered the worst blow. Soybean exports to China collapsed by 75%, falling from $12 billion in 2017 to just $3.1 billion in 2019, according to the USDA. Trump attempted to offset losses with $28 billion in farm subsidies, but farmers struggled with plummeting sales, rising input costs, and mounting debt. Meanwhile, U.S. manufacturers, forced to pay higher costs for imported components, saw profits shrink. A report from the National Bureau of Economic Research found the tariffs cost American households an average of $1,277 annually due to inflationary pressures. China, rather than capitulating, turned to alternative suppliers, reshaping global trade in the process. China's crude oil imports from Canada surged 88% year-over-year in 2023, reaching 220,000 barrels per day per the China General Administration of Customs. The shift was accelerated by Beijing's push to diversify energy sources amid U.S. sanctions and rising geopolitical tensions. Canada's oil sands, once heavily reliant on U.S. buyers, found a lucrative alternative market in China, aided by investments in Pacific Coast export infrastructure. Meanwhile, American crude shipments to China dropped 61% from 2018 levels, as tariffs and political uncertainty made U.S. oil less attractive. The decline coincided with China deepening energy ties with Russia, Iran, and Saudi Arabia, securing long-term contracts that locked out U.S. suppliers. According to Bloomberg, Beijing now holds record crude stockpiles, ensuring energy security while weakening Washington's leverage in the global oil market. Canadian liquefied natural gas, LNG exports to China skyrocketed by 215% in 2023, surpassing U.S. shipments for the first time, according to the International Energy Agency. The shift was driven by a combination of logistics, reliability, and geopolitical tensions. Canada's Pacific LNG projects provide a direct shipping route to China, cutting transit times by 10 days compared to U.S. Gulf Coast terminals. Meanwhile, American LNG exports to China fell 38% in 2 years, hampered by Biden administration restrictions on new export permits and mounting concerns over price volatility. China's $400 billion energy deal with Russia, which includes pipeline gas and LNG, further reduced U.S. market share. As a result, U.S. firms like Cheniere Energy and Sempra have been forced to pivot toward European buyers, where demand remains high but competition is fierce. China's agricultural imports from the U.S. plummeted 53% since 2018, according to USDA data, with Beijing shifting its purchasing power to Brazil, Canada, and the European Union. Brazil now supplies over 75% of China's soybean imports, a sharp rise from 35% in 2017. The shift has devastated U.S. farmers, who once relied on China for over 60% of their soybean exports. The American Farm Bureau reports that U.S. farm bankruptcies surged 20% in 2023 as Chinese demand collapsed. Meanwhile, Canada has expanded its wheat and canola exports to China, benefiting from trade agreements that exclude U.S. tariffs. Beijing's investments in Brazilian infrastructure, including new railway projects to speed up grain exports, further cemented the shift away from American agriculture. China's pork imports from the U.S. dropped 47% in 2023, according to Reuters, as European suppliers dominated the market. Spain and Denmark now account for over 60% of China's pork imports, while Canada's share has steadily climbed. The U.S., once China's leading pork supplier, lost ground due to higher tariffs, regulatory disputes, and safety concerns. In contrast, EU pork producers received regulatory approval to bypass certain trade restrictions, allowing for seamless exports. American hog farmers, already struggling with rising feed costs and labor shortages, have seen revenues shrink, forcing many to scale back production or exit the industry entirely. The decline in Chinese demand has also impacted U.S. processing plants, with Smithfield Foods, owned by a Chinese conglomerate, reducing U.S. operations amid weakening exports. China's shift away from U.S. technology imports has cost American firms over $110 billion in lost sales since 2018, according to an analysis by the Rhodium Group. Beijing's aggressive push for semiconductor self-sufficiency slashed purchases from U.S. giants like Qualcomm, Intel, and Nvidia. Qualcomm's China revenue fell 22% in 2023, while Apple's iPhone sales dropped 24% year over year due to expanding domestic competition from Huawei and Xiaomi. China's decision to ban Intel and AMD chips from government systems and its preference for homegrown alternatives has further eroded U.S. market dominance. Meanwhile, the $50 billion CHIPS Act aimed at revitalizing U.S. semiconductor production has yet to counter China's progress. Beijing's investments in chip manufacturing surged 49% in 2023, with firms like SMIC producing advanced chips despite U.S. export controls. As China accelerates tech independence, U.S. firms face an existential crisis in their most profitable overseas market. Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau's decision to pivot trade away from the U.S. has intensified economic disruptions for American manufacturers. The U.S. Commerce Department reported that U.S. exports to Canada dropped 12.5% in 2023, with sectors like steel, automotive, and agriculture bearing the brunt. Canadian importers, incentivized by federal programs promoting local suppliers, have increasingly favored European and domestic alternatives. The Canadian government's Buy Canada initiative redirected $25 billion worth of procurement contracts away from U.S. firms, leading to losses for American businesses in construction, infrastructure, and energy. The National Association of Manufacturers warns that continued trade deterioration with Canada could cost up to 150,000 U.S. jobs over the next 3 years. Meanwhile, Ottawa has deepened economic ties with China, securing $10.5 billion in new trade agreements in 2023, further displacing American firms from the Canadian market. The historically stable U.S.-Canada trade partnership is now under strain as tariffs, subsidies, and geopolitical tensions disrupt supply chains. Bilateral trade fell to $762 billion in 2023, down from $792 billion in 2022, according to the U.S. Census Bureau. Canada's increased reliance on China and the European Union has weakened American leverage in negotiations, while disputes over softwood lumber tariffs and dairy exports have further fueled tensions. The Canadian Chamber of Commerce has expressed concern over rising regulatory barriers affecting U.S. goods, while American manufacturers face higher costs due to retaliatory tariffs on aluminum and steel imports. With trade uncertainty mounting, experts warn that Washington's reliance on Canada as its top trading partner is no longer guaranteed, especially as Ottawa diversifies economic alliances to reduce dependence on the U.S. The energy threat that could spike prices. Canada supplies over 60% of America's imported crude oil, but growing political rifts could put this energy lifeline at risk. Canadian officials have threatened to review cross-border pipeline agreements, citing environmental concerns and trade disputes. A temporary closure of Enbridge's Line 5 pipeline in 2023, which supplies oil to the Midwest, caused a 13% surge in regional gasoline prices within 2 weeks, highlighting the U.S.'s vulnerability to Canadian energy disruptions. With global crude prices already volatile, a further reduction in Canadian oil shipments could force U.S. refiners to rely on costlier imports from the Middle East, driving up consumer fuel costs. Industry analysts at Rystad Energy estimate that a 10% drop in Canadian oil exports to the U.S. would increase domestic gasoline prices by 35 cents per gallon, intensifying inflationary pressures across industries reliant on fuel. China has aggressively shifted its oil supply away from the U.S., strengthening ties with Russia, Iran, and Venezuela through long-term agreements that undermine Washington's influence in global energy markets. Russian crude exports to China surged 45% in 2023, reaching 2.13 million barrels per day, according to Chinese customs data. Iran, which was once crippled by U.S. sanctions, increased its oil shipments to China by 40%, selling over 1.2 million barrels daily under discounted contracts. Meanwhile, Venezuela, despite sanctions, has expanded crude exports to China by 36%, leveraging intermediaries and digital payment systems to bypass restrictions. With China's state-owned refiners securing exclusive supply deals, U.S. exporters have seen their market share shrink. The U.S. Energy Information Administration reported a 68% drop in American crude shipments to China over 5 years, signaling a deliberate strategy by Beijing to marginalize U.S. energy dominance while securing favorable pricing and political leverage with alternative suppliers. Canada's growing economic footprint in Europe has begun eroding U.S. influence in key industries, particularly in energy and agriculture. The Canada-EU Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement, or CETA, has allowed Canadian firms to expand market share in natural gas, aerospace, and food exports, sectors where the U.S. was previously dominant. According to the European Commission, Canadian energy exports to the EU increased 59% in 2023, surpassing U.S. shipments for the first time. Meanwhile, Canadian agricultural exports, particularly in wheat and beef, have seen double-digit growth, reducing Europe's reliance on U.S. suppliers. With the U.S. facing growing skepticism from European regulators over trade policies and subsidies, Canada has capitalized on Washington's diplomatic missteps, positioning itself as a stable, tariff-free alternative for European buyers. The U.S. faces one of its most significant trade realignments in decades as geopolitical tensions, protectionist policies, and shifting alliances threaten its global dominance. The International Monetary Fund projects U.S. GDP growth to slow to 1.6% in 2024, down from 2.5% in 2023, reflecting weakened trade relationships and inflationary pressures. The World Bank estimates that China's share of global trade will overtake the U.S. by 2026, driven by Beijing's aggressive supply chain expansion and strategic trade pacts. Meanwhile, BRICS nations have increased intra-bloc trade by 43%, diminishing Washington's ability to control global commerce. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce warns that unless Washington adapts its trade policies to regain lost ground, American firms could face a $500 billion loss in export revenues by 2030 as competitors solidify alternative trade networks. With rising debt, declining industrial output, and increasing global economic fragmentation, the U.S. must act decisively to restore its influence or risk long-term decline. The next trade war has already begun. China, Canada, and the European Union aren't waiting for the U.S. to adapt. They're actively restructuring global trade to minimize reliance on Washington. While American policymakers debate tariffs and domestic production incentives, competitors are securing supply chains. expanding export markets, and locking in long-term agreements that sideline U.S. influence. The real question isn't whether the U.S. is losing ground. It's whether Washington has the political will and economic strategy to reverse course before it's too late. What's your take? Can the U.S. reclaim its trade dominance, or are we witnessing the beginning of a long-term shift in global power? We're glad you're enjoying this video. Please like and subscribe. Check out another video that is now on your screen.